In January of 1888, when the worst blizzard in Minnesota history was killing 67 people across 4 counties, 12 families trudged through knee-deep snow in minus 47-degree winds to reach a hole in a hillside. They came to the home of the 17-year-old girl they had called the crazy orphan, digging her own grave. That girl was inside wearing a cotton shirt, brewing tea, while her dog slept peacefully by a fire that burned clean and hot. The families who had mocked her were about to beg for her help, and she would give it freely without asking for a single word of apology. But this story does not begin in the blizzard. It begins in August of 1887 in the timber country outside Duluth, Minnesota territory, when Sigrid Brennan learned that the only family she had left no longer wanted her. See, she was 17 years old. She stood 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed perhaps 105 pounds. Her hands were calloused from 2 years of cooking, cleaning, hauling wood, and tending gardens for people who were not her parents. Her parents were dead. They had been dead for 2 years, taken by a flash flood that came down the valley without warning on a spring afternoon when Sigrid happened to be on the hillside picking berries with her dog. She had watched the water from above. She had seen it sweep through the cabin where her mother and father were working. She had screamed until her throat bled. And then she had walked to her Aunt Moira's house because there was nowhere else to go. Aunt Moira was her mother's sister. She had married a lumber camp worker named Samuel Carrick, in a practical man who saw his wife's orphan niece as another mouth to feed rather than a child who needed love. He was not cruel exactly. He simply had no patience for anything that cost him money without returning value. For 2 years, Sigrid had returned value. She had worked from dawn until dark. She had made herself small and quiet and useful. She had never complained, never asked for anything, never reminded them that she was grieving for parents who had been alive and laughing just 24 months ago. None of it mattered. On a humid August afternoon, Samuel Carrick sat Sigrid down at the kitchen table and told her she had 3 weeks to find somewhere else to live. He had calculated the cost of feeding her through another Minnesota winter, and the numbers did not work. He handed her $12, payment for 2 years of labor, and told her to disappear. Sigrid took the money without argument. Her father had taught her many things. Perhaps the most important was this: you do not waste energy fighting battles you cannot win. You find another way. She packed her few belongings into a canvas sack: a change of clothes, a wool blanket, a knife her father had given her on her 14th birthday, and a leather-bound notebook filled with her father's handwriting, his sketches, his diagrams, his carefully recorded observations about wood and weather and survival. Aunt Moira stood in the doorway as Sigrid left. She was crying, but she did not speak. She did not offer help or money or even a proper goodbye. She simply watched her dead sister's daughter walk away with a dog and $12 and no place in the world to go. For Sigrid did not look back. Her father's name was Padraig Brennan. He had come to America from Ireland in 1862, but the knowledge he carried came from much farther away. His wife Astrid was Norwegian, and her father Magnus had been a forester in the mountains outside Bergen. Magnus understood trees the way some men understood horses or weather. He understood them deeply, instinctively, with knowledge passed down through generations of people who lived and died by what the forest provided. When Astrid married Padraig, Magnus gave his new son-in-law a gift more valuable than money. He gave him knowledge. He taught Padraig the old Norwegian methods for working with wood, methods that had been developed over centuries in a climate that killed the unprepared without mercy. And Padraig had taught his daughter. Sir Sigrid remembered those winter afternoons in her father's workshop like they had happened yesterday. She remembered the smell of wood shavings and pipe smoke. She remembered her father's voice, patient and precise, explaining principles that seemed like magic but were actually simple science. The most important lesson was about firewood. Freshly cut wood is wet, her father had explained. Dangerously, uselessly wet. When you fell a tree and cut it into logs, the wood contains 50 to 100% moisture, sometimes more water by weight than wood. You cannot burn green wood efficiently. Most of the energy goes into evaporating the water before any useful heat is produced. He had drawn diagrams in his notebook. A pound of dry, seasoned wood produces roughly 8,000 BDUs of heat. Pound of green wood produces barely 4,000. You are burning twice the wood for the same warmth. Sigrid had nodded, not fully understanding why this mattered so much. Her father had smiled. Seasoning is the process of drying wood to the point where it burns efficiently, he said, getting moisture content down to 15 or 20%. The conventional method is simple. Stack wood outdoors in a sheltered location and wait 6 months minimum. 12 months is better. But there is a problem, he continued. Outdoor seasoning in a place like Minnesota is nearly impossible to do well. Rain and snow keep re-wetting the wood. Freezing temperatures in winter damage the wood fibers when moisture inside the logs freezes and expands. Most families deal with this by cutting enormous quantities of wood in summer and burning through winter stocks that are partially wet. Inefficient, wasteful. Sigrid had asked if there was a better way. Her father's eyes had lit up. He had pulled out his notebook and turned to a page covered with sketches. Your grandfather Magnus showed me this, he said, a system used by Norwegian foresters who needed reliable dry wood through brutal winters. You season the wood underground, in a tunnel dug into a hillside. He had explained the science. The constant underground temperature prevents frost damage. An air channel through the tunnel, driven by the natural slope, creates continuous airflow that removes moisture from the wood steadily and consistently. The result is perfectly seasoned wood in 4 to 6 weeks, a fraction of the time outdoor seasoning requires. Sigrid had studied the diagrams. The tunnel entrance faced south to catch warmth from the sun. The exhaust vent at the far end faced north, staying cooler in the shade. Warm air rises, cool air sinks. The temperature difference between the two openings drives air movement through the tunnel continuously, passively, without any mechanical help. She had asked why they did not build one themselves. Her father had smiled and said they might someday, when they found the right hillside. They never did. The flood came first, and Patrick Brennan died with his knowledge locked in a notebook that his daughter carried in a canvas sack as she walked away from the only home she had left. Sigrid found the land on her third day of searching, 5 acres on the side of a glacial ridge, 2 miles outside Duluth. The soil was poor, mostly clay and gravel left by retreating glaciers thousands of years earlier. The slope was steep, too steep for farming, too rocky for easy building. Nobody wanted it. The Territorial Land Office was practically giving it away. Sigrid wanted it more than she had ever wanted anything, because the slope was perfect. The ridge ran roughly north to south. The lower end faced south, catching sun. The upper end faced north, staying shaded. The angle was steep enough to drive airflow, but not so steep that digging would be impossible. She had found her hillside. She staked her claim in early September and spent $8 of her 12 on materials for a small cabin. The remaining $4 would have to last through winter. Most people would have said it was impossible. Most people would have given up before they started. Sigrid was not most people. She built the cabin in 2 weeks. Rough-hewn timber construction, simple peaked roof, single fireplace, 140 square feet of living space. It was crude and small and barely adequate. It was not the point. The point was the hillside behind the cabin. The point was the tunnel she was going to dig. Her dog Odin watched her work from the shade of a pine tree. He was a shepherd mix, gray and black with intelligent brown eyes. She had found him as a puppy 2 years before the flood, abandoned on a road outside town. He had been with her through everything since, through her parents' deaths, through the silent grief of living with people who did not love her, Through the moment when she walked away from Aunt Moira's house with nothing but a sack and a notebook and a desperate plan. Odin was the only family she had left. She talked to him while she worked. She told him about the tunnels she was going to build. She told him about her father's diagrams and her grandfather's knowledge and the way wood needed to breathe to dry properly. Odin listened with his head tilted, as if he understood every word. Maybe he did. What would you do if you were 17 years old, alone in the world with $12 and a piece of knowledge everyone thought was crazy? Would you trust what your father taught you? Or would you listen to the people who said it could not be done? The excavation began in early October, when the leaves were turning gold and the first hints of winter sharpened the morning air. Sigrid dug horizontally into the hillside at the base of the slope, not down from the top like a well or a root cellar, sideways into the earth like a mine entrance. The tunnel would extend 18 feet into the hillside, following the natural slope upward at a gentle angle. The Minnesota glacial till she was digging through was a mixture of clay, sand, gravel, and occasional boulders. Harder than loose soil, but softer than solid rock. She used a heavy spade and a pickaxe, working methodically through the material. Each spadeful weighed perhaps 12 to 15 pounds. Each foot of tunnel required removing roughly 30 cubic feet of earth, hundreds of individual spadefuls. The work was brutal. Sigrid weighed 105 pounds. She had never done anything this physically demanding in her life. She worked from dawn to dusk. By evening, her hands were raw and bleeding. Her back screamed with pain. Her clothes were soaked through with sweat despite the October cold. She ate cold biscuits and dried meat because she was too exhausted to cook. She fell asleep on her narrow cot with Odin pressed against her side, his warmth the only comfort in the dark. And every morning, she got up and did it again. The neighbors noticed. In a community as small and isolated as the settlements outside Duluth, everyone noticed everything. Word spread quickly that the orphan girl on the ridge was digging some kind of hole into the hillside. Speculation ran wild. A mine? A root cellar? A place to hide from the winter she clearly was not prepared to survive? The first skeptic arrived on the fourth day of digging. His name was Gustav Lindqvist. He was Swedish, a former miner who had worked the copper deposits in Michigan before moving to Minnesota for the timber work. He was 53 years old, barrel-chested, with hands like shovels and a voice like gravel. He knew more about digging holes than anyone else in the territory. He stood at the entrance of Sigrid's half-completed tunnel and shook his head slowly. "What do you think you are doing, girl?" Sigrid did not stop working. "Building a tunnel. I can see that. Why?" "To dry wood." Gustav laughed, not cruelly, but with genuine bewilderment. "To dry wood, underground, where it is damp. It will not be damp. There will be airflow." Gustav walked into the tunnel, studying the walls, the angle, the rough timbers Sigrid had begun installing for support. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to face her. "Why, I have dug mines for 30 years, he said. "I have seen tunnels collapse on men. I have pulled bodies from rubble. This tunnel of yours has no proper shoring. The walls are not reinforced correctly. The ceiling will fall in the first heavy rain. And even if it does not collapse, wood stored underground will rot. The earth is wet. Underground is wet. This is not how wood drying works." Sigrid kept digging. "In Norway, they do it this way." "This is not Norway. The physics are the same." Gustav stared at her. A 17-year-old girl covered in dirt and sweat, correcting a man with 30 years of mining experience. He did not know whether to be impressed or offended. "You will kill yourself," he said finally. "This tunnel will collapse, or the wood will rot, or you will freeze to death because your foolish system does not work. I have seen stubborn people before. I have buried some of them." He turned and disappeared down the ridge, shaking his head the entire way. Sigrid watched him go. Then she returned to her digging. The second skeptic arrived a week later. Her name was Margareta Holstad, and she was the most powerful woman in the territory. Her husband, Henrik, owned the largest lumber yard in Duluth. They lived in a fine house with glass windows and a proper kitchen. Margareta organized the church socials and the charity drives and the community meetings. When she spoke, people listened. She did not come alone. She brought 5 other women from the area, all of them dressed in clean wool dresses, all of them looking at Sigrid's muddy clothes and rough cabin, with expressions that mixed pity with disdain. Margaret was 46 years old, sharp-featured, one with gray streaks in her dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had known Sigrid's mother Astrid before the flood. They had not been close friends, but they had been friendly enough. That history made what she was about to say feel almost like concern. Almost. "We came to see how you are settling in," Margaret said, her eyes scanning the property. "The women of the community look after our own." Sigrid stood at the tunnel entrance, pickaxe in hand, dirt streaking her face. "I am settling in fine. We could not help noticing that you have no firewood." Margaret gestured at the bare ground around the cabin. "Every homestead needs a woodpile. Winter is coming. Where is your wood?" "In the tunnel." The women exchanged glances. Margaret's expression sharpened. "In the tunnel?" "The hole you are digging into the hillside." "Yes. Show us." Sigrid led them to the tunnel entrance. It was nearly complete now, 18 feet deep, 6 feet wide at the base, 5.5 feet high. The walls were lined with rough timber planks. Racks for holding wood stood along both sides. The far end was still being finished, but the basic structure was clear. The women peered inside. They saw dirt and timber and shadows. They did not see a woodpile. Margaret turned to face Sigrid. Her expression was no longer concern. It was pitying. "Child," she said, "I do not know what you think you are building, but I have lived in this territory for 23 years. I have survived winters that killed strong men, and I have never seen anyone try to store firewood in a hole in the ground. It is not storage. Oh, it is drying." "Drying?" Margaret's voice rose. "Wood does not dry underground. Underground is damp. Underground is wet. The wood will mold, then rot, and by January, you will have nothing but a tunnel full of useless mush while you freeze to death in that pitiful cabin." The other women nodded. One of them whispered something about calling the poor thing's aunt. Margrethe stepped closer to Sigrid. "Your mother was a good woman. She would not want you to die because of some foolish idea you got into your head. Let us help you. We can find you work in town, a place to stay. You do not have to do this alone." Sigrid looked at the woman who had known her mother. She felt something shift in her chest. Anger, maybe, or just exhaustion. "My father taught me this system," she said quietly. "His knowledge came from my grandfather in Norway. And it works. You will see." Margaret stared at her for a long moment. Then she shook her head slowly. "The orphan girl is digging her own grave before she is even dead," she said to the other women, "and she is too proud to admit she is wrong." They left without another word. Sigrid watched them go, then turned back to her tunnel. Odin sat at the entrance, watching her with his intelligent eyes. "They do not understand," Sigrid said to him, "but they will." The third skeptic was Father Callahan. He came on a Sunday afternoon, still wearing his vestments from morning mass. He was Irish like Sigrid's father, 62 years old with white hair and kind eyes and a voice that could fill a church without shouting. He had buried Sigrid's parents. He had spoken words of comfort at their graves while Sigrid stood silent and dry-eyed, too shocked to cry. He found her at the tunnel entrance, installing the final timber supports. "Sigrid," he said gently, "may I speak with you?" She stopped working but did not put down her tools. "Yes, Father." He looked at the tunnel. At the carefully constructed entrance, the timber-lined walls, the strange vertical shaft she was digging at the far end for ventilation. He had heard the rumors. Everyone had heard the rumors. The orphan girl building some kind of underground storage that made no sense. People are worried about you, he said. I know. They say you are building something unusual, something that cannot work. Sigrid wiped sweat from her forehead. It will work. Father Callahan was quiet for a moment. He had known Padraig Brennan. He had respected the man, even if Padraig had not attended Mass as often as the father would have liked. Padraig had been practical and intelligent and not given to foolish ideas. But this tunnel, there is something I must say to you, child, and I say it with love. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes when we lose the people we love, we become desperate. We cling to things they taught us, things they believed, even when those things do not make sense. It is natural, it is human, but it can also be dangerous. Sigrid's jaw tightened. My father was not a fool. No, he was not, but he was also not here in Minnesota, in this specific place. What works in Norway may not work here. What your grandfather knew about forests across the ocean may not apply to forests in America. The physics are the same everywhere, Father. Father Callahan sighed. He had tried. He could see that trying further would only drive her deeper into stubbornness. I will pray for you, he said. I will pray that you find wisdom before winter finds you. He blessed her and walked away. Sigrid stood at the tunnel entrance for a long time after he left, her father's notebook clutched in her hands. She opened it to the page with the tunnel diagrams. Her father's handwriting filled the margins. Notes about temperature, notes about airflow, notes about the mistakes other people made and how to avoid them. At the bottom of the page in smaller writing was a sentence she had not noticed before. When they doubt you, remember, the wood knows nothing of their opinions. It only knows whether it is wet or dry. Sigrid closed the notebook. She picked up her tools. She went back to work. Have you ever had knowledge that no one else believed in? Something you knew was true because someone you trusted had taught you? What did it feel like when people said you were wrong? By the third week, something inside Sigrid began to crack. Her hands were no longer just raw. They were bleeding through the rags she wrapped around them each morning. The skin on her palms had torn open so many times that it would not heal. Every swing of the pickaxe sent fire up her arms. Every shovel of dirt made her back scream with a pain that had become her constant companion. She had moved perhaps 12 feet into the hillside. 6 more to go. 6 more feet that felt like 600 miles. On the 18th day, Sigrid stopped. She sat down in the half-finished tunnel, her back against the cold dirt wall, her bloody hands hanging limp at her sides. The lamp flickered beside her, casting shadows that looked like the walls were closing in. The air smelled like earth and sweat and desperation. She was going to fail. The thought arrived clearly, without emotion, like a fact about the weather. She was going to fail. The tunnel would never be finished. The skeptics were right. She would freeze to death in her crude cabin, and everyone would shake their heads and say they had warned her. Odin appeared at the tunnel entrance. He walked slowly toward her, his nails clicking on the packed dirt floor, and lay down with his head on her leg. His brown eyes looked up at her without judgment, without expectation, just love. Sigrid stroked his fur with her ruined hands. She did not cry. She had forgotten how. I cannot do this, she whispered to the dog. Papa, I cannot do this. But even as she said the words, her hand found the notebook in her coat pocket, her father's notebook. She pulled it out and opened it to the tunnel diagrams, the pages soft from years of handling. And there at the bottom of the page, in writing so small she had never noticed it before, was a sentence in her father's careful hand. When the work breaks you, remember, the hardest wood was once the softest seed. Patience, my daughter. Sigrid stared at the words. Her father had written them. Her father who had never built the tunnel he dreamed of. Her father who had died before he could see if his knowledge would work. He had written those words knowing that someday his daughter would need them, knowing that someday she would sit in the darkness, bleeding and exhausted, ready to give up. What he had believed in her even then, even before she was born, even from beyond the grave. Something shifted in Sigrid's chest. Not strength exactly. Something quieter than that. Something like peace. She closed the notebook. She picked up the pickaxe. She stood up on legs that trembled with exhaustion, and she started digging again. The tunnel was finished in late October, 18 feet long, bored into the hillside at a gentle upward angle. Timber-lined walls and ceiling. A sturdy door frame at the entrance, facing south to catch the warmth of the winter sun. An 8-inch vertical shaft at the far end, rising 4 feet through the earth to emerge on the upper slope, facing north to stay cool in the shade. 2 openings, one warm, one cool. The temperature difference would drive air continuously through the tunnel, day and night, and without any mechanical help. Sigrid tested the system before she loaded any wood. She lit a small smoke fire near the lower entrance and watched. The smoke drifted into the tunnel, moved through it slowly but steadily, and emerged from the upper vent on the hillside above. The airflow was real, gentle, maybe a few feet per second, but continuous and consistent. She began filling the tunnel immediately. Cutting trees from the ridge was hard work. Dragging the logs down to the entrance was harder. But she had done hard work before. She had been doing hard work her entire life. The difference now was that the work had purpose. The work had meaning. The work was building something her father had dreamed of and never gotten to see. She loaded perhaps 2 cords of green wood onto the racks inside the tunnel. Fresh-cut logs, heavy with moisture, practically dripping sap. The skeptics would have laughed if they could see them. Green wood in a hole in the ground, waiting to rot. Sigrid closed the door, left the upper vent open, and waited. The first 2 weeks, nothing visible happened. The logs sat in the tunnel, green and heavy, looking exactly as they had when she carried them in. Sigrid checked every few days. She opened the entrance door, reached into the tunnel, felt the surface of the logs. Still damp, still heavy, still green. But something was happening that she could not feel yet. The air flowing through the tunnel was carrying moisture away from the wood surface, one invisible layer at a time. The constant temperature inside, around 40 degrees, never freezing, never warming, meant the moisture was evaporating at a consistent rate. The wood fibers were not contracting and expanding with temperature swings. The moisture was leaving cleanly, steadily, without damage. By the end of the 3rd week, Sigrid noticed the change. She reached into the tunnel and touched a log. The surface was drier. Not dry, but noticeably less damp than it had been. The smell had shifted, too. The sharp green sap smell was fading, replaced by the warmer, woodier smell of drying timber. By week 4, the transformation was unmistakable. The logs had lost significant weight. She could tell by lifting one end. The surface was dry to the touch. The wood had taken on the lighter color of seasoned timber. Sigrid split one log with her axe to check the interior. The cross-section showed wood that was perhaps 60% of the way to fully seasoned. By week 6, the wood was done. She split a test log and held a match to a chip. It caught immediately. The flame was clean and hot. Nothing like the sputtering, smoking mess that green wood produced. Her father had been right about everything. Sigrid carried the seasoned logs into her cabin. She built a fire in the fireplace. The wood burned beautifully, hot, clean, steady. One log produced more useful heat than 3 green logs would have. Her small cabin warmed quickly and maintained a comfortable temperature with minimal wood consumption. Outside, November had arrived. The first snows were falling. The temperature was dropping. Other families were beginning to burn through their wood supplies, wood that was poorly seasoned and inefficient, wood that smoked and sputtered and produced disappointing heat. Sigrid's cabin stayed warm with half the fuel. And the neighbors noticed something strange about her property almost immediately. There was no woodpile. Every other homestead in the area had a woodpile, stacks of logs and split wood visible from the road, growing through summer and shrinking through winter. Sigrid's property had nothing: a small cabin, a tool shed, and bare ground. No wood anywhere visible. They had watched her cutting trees on the ridge throughout September and October. They had seen her hauling logs down the hillside. But the logs disappeared. No stacking, no splitting into firewood, just green logs carried to the base of the ridge and vanishing behind the cabin where the hillside rose. Margareta Holstad talked about it at the general store. She talked about it at church. She talked about it to anyone who would listen. The orphan girl has no firewood, she said, shaking her head. She put it all in that tunnel of hers. It must have rotted by now. She will come begging for help by December. Mark my words. But December came, and Sigrid did not come begging. December came, and smoke rose steadily from her chimney while her neighbors burned through their supplies 3 times faster than they had planned. December came, and the 17-year-old girl on the ridge was warm, while the families who had pitied her were beginning to worry about their own survival. Something was wrong with the picture. Something did not make sense. Old Jacob Morrison was the first to understand. He was 78 years old, a former timber worker who had spent his life in forests from Cornwall to Michigan to Minnesota. He had seen things in his youth that younger people had forgotten. And he had worked with methods that had been abandoned in favor of what was supposedly better. He came to Sigrid's property on a gray December afternoon, moving slowly up the ridge with the careful steps of a man who knew his bones were fragile. Odin barked at his approach, then quieted when Sigrid put a hand on his head. "Miss Brennan," Jakob said, tipping his hat, "I have been watching your chimney smoke." Sigrid waited. "Clean smoke," he continued. "Not the thick white smoke of wet wood. Clean and light, the smoke of properly seasoned timber." He paused. "Your neighbors are burning wet wood. You are not. I would like to know how." Sigrid studied him for a moment. He was the first person who had come to her property without pity or criticism in his eyes. He had come with curiosity, with respect. "Would you like to see?" she asked. She led him to the tunnel entrance. Jakob studied the door frame, the careful construction, the angle of the entrance relative to the slope. Then she opened the door and let him step inside. He was quiet for a long time. The tunnel stretched 18 feet into the hillside, lit by a lamp Sigrid carried. Timber-lined walls, solid timber ceiling, and everywhere on the racks, on the floor, stacked against the walls, logs. Dozens of logs, all of them dry, bone dry, the golden color of perfectly seasoned wood. Jakob picked up a piece and knocked on it with his knuckles. The hollow sound of properly seasoned timber, not the dull thud of wet wood. "Your father taught you this," he said quietly. Sigrid nodded. "My grandfather in Norway. He passed it to my father. My father passed it to me. I have seen something similar. In Cornwall, maybe 50 years ago, we called them drying caves." Jakob set the wood down and turned to face her. "The old miners used them to season pit props. I had forgotten. Everyone has forgotten." He looked at her with something new in his eyes, something that might have been hope. "You remembered," he said. "Knowledge that takes generations to build can be lost in a single generation when people stop listening. What wisdom from your parents or grandparents do you still carry with you?" The signs began in the first week of January, 1888. Birds that should have been sheltering for winter flew south in massive, disorganized flocks. Rabbits and deer vanished from their usual trails. The sky took on a strange grayish-yellow color that made the old-timers nervous. Old Jacob Morrison came to Sigrid's property on January 8th. His face was grave. "Oh, something is coming," he said. "I have seen this sky before. In 1856, before the worst storm of my life, get your wood inside, get everything you need inside, and do not go out again until it passes. Sigrid trusted him. She spent the next 4 days hauling seasoned wood from the tunnel into her cabin. 2 weeks' worth, maybe more. She filled every corner, every space, until she could barely move without stepping over logs. On January 11th, she sealed the tunnel entrance tight. On January 12th, the storm arrived. It began like many winter storms. Snow falling steadily in the morning, wind picking up toward noon, visibility dropping through the afternoon. The temperature had been 15 degrees at dawn. By noon it was 0. By sunset it was 20 below, and it kept falling. By midnight, the temperature had dropped to 35 below 0. The wind screamed across the ridge at 55 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally through the darkness. The wind chill pushed the effective temperature to 70 below. Sigrid's cabin shuddered with each gust. Frost formed on the inside of the windows, on the walls, on every surface that faced the outside. The world beyond her door became a howling white void where nothing could survive for more than minutes. Inside, her fire burned steadily. The seasoned wood caught easily, burned hot and clean, filling the small cabin with steady warmth, while the world outside tried to kill everything it touched. Her cabin held at 58 degrees while the storm raged. Not warm by summer standards, but warm enough, comfortable enough, survivable. Odin slept by the fire, Harna unbothered by the apocalypse outside. Sigrid wrapped herself in blankets and listened to the wind. She thought about her father. She thought about her grandfather Magnus in Norway, teaching a young Irish immigrant the secrets of surviving winter. She thought about all the people who had called her foolish and wondered how they were doing tonight. She would find out soon enough. The Holstad house was the finest in the territory. 2 stories, glass windows, a proper kitchen with a cast iron stove. Henrik and Margaret had 4 children and enough money to buy whatever they needed. What they could not buy was properly seasoned wood. Their woodpile was enormous, 10 cords stacked behind the house, enough to last 2 winters under normal circumstances. But normal circumstances involved wood that had been seasoned for 6 months outdoors, wood that was still 40% moisture, wood that burned poorly and produced half the heat it should have. By the second day of the storm, the Holstad house was 50 degrees inside, despite fires burning in every fireplace. By the third day, it was 45 degrees. By the fourth day, 40 degrees. And Margaret was beginning to feel real fear. Henrik burned through 3 cords of wood in 4 days, feeding fires that sputtered and smoked and failed to warm the house properly. The children huddled under every blanket they owned. The youngest, a boy of 4, had stopped shivering, which was worse than shivering. It meant his body was beginning to give up. "We have to do something," Margaret said. Henrik stared at the fire that was failing to save them. "What can we do? The wood is wet. All the wood in this territory is wet. Everyone seasons the same way." Not everyone, Margaret thought. Not the orphan girl. She had heard the rumors in the weeks before the storm, smoke rising clean from Sigrid's chimney. No visible woodpile, but plenty of heat. The tunnel that was supposed to have failed, that should have been full of rotting wood by now. She had laughed at those rumors. She had called Sigrid foolish and proud and destined to freeze. Now her children were the ones in danger of freezing. The storm continued through days 5 and 6. Temperatures plunged to 47 below 0. Wind gusts reached 60 miles per hour. Snow piled in drifts 15 feet high on the north sides of buildings. On the evening of day 6, Jasper Whitfield made a decision that would cost him 2 fingers. Jasper was 22 years old, strong and confident and convinced that he knew better than anyone else. He had laughed loudest when people talked about the orphan girl's tunnel. He had bet money that she would be dead by February. Now his family's woodpile was running low, and what remained was frozen solid under 4 feet of snow. He decided to go out and dig some of it free. "Don't," his mother said. "The cold will kill you." "I'll only be a minute," Jasper said. "The woodpile is 30 feet from the door." He bundled up in every layer of clothing he owned. He wrapped his face in scarves until only his eyes were visible. He stepped out into the storm. He got lost in 15 seconds. The whiteout was complete. He could not see his own hand in front of his face. The wind spun him around, disoriented him, sent him stumbling in a direction he thought was toward the woodpile, but was actually toward nothing. He wandered in the storm for 2 hours before he found his way back to the house by pure luck. By then, his hands had frozen solid inside his gloves. The tips of 3 fingers were white and hard as marble. His mother found him collapsed against the door frame, his hands frozen into claws. She screamed loud enough for the neighbors to hear over the wind. But nobody could help. Nobody could leave their own homes. She had to thaw her son's hands alone, watching the white turn to purple, turn to black, knowing that some of that blackness would never come back to life. 3 weeks later, when the doctor finally reached them, he would remove the 2 dead fingers with a saw. Jasper would feel every cut. When there was no anesthesia left in the territory, he was 22 years old. He had laughed loudest at Sigrid's tunnel. He would carry the cost of that laughter for the rest of his life. On the morning of day 7, Henrik Holstad made a decision. He had heard the rumors about Sigrid's tunnel. He had dismissed them like everyone else. But now his house was 38 degrees inside despite burning wood constantly. His children were weak and pale and moving too slowly. His wife's eyes held a fear he had never seen before. He could not save his family with the wood he had. "I am going to the Brennan girls' property," he said. Margaret stared at him. "You will die out there." "I will die in here if I do nothing. At least this way there is a chance." He bundled up the same way Jasper Whitfield had bundled up. But Henrik was more careful. He tied a rope around his waist and anchored the other end to the door handle. If he got lost, he could follow the rope back. He stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The wind tried to knock him off his feet. Snow drove into his face so hard that it felt like needles. He could not see, could not hear, could barely breathe. But he kept walking. The Brennan property was 2 miles away. In normal weather, it was a 30-minute walk. In this storm, it took Henrik nearly 3 hours. He fell 11 times. He got turned around twice and had to backtrack. His feet went numb, then his hands, then his face. By the time he reached the cabin on the ridge, he was barely conscious. He could not feel his extremities. He could not form coherent thoughts. He could only stumble forward, one step at a time, following the faint glow of firelight through the snow. He collapsed against Sigrid's door. She opened it immediately, as if she had been waiting. She grabbed him under the arms and dragged him inside. She pulled off his frozen gloves, his ice-covered coat, his boots that had to be pried off 1 inch at a time. "How many others?" she asked. Henrik tried to speak. His jaw would not work properly. His teeth chattered so hard that he bit his tongue. "How many families are in trouble?" He held up fingers. 10, maybe more. Sigrid looked at Odin. The dog was already at the door, ready. "Rest here," she said to Henrik. "When you can move, I will show you the tunnel. Your family and anyone else who needs it can take as much wood as they can carry." Henrik stared at her. This girl who had been mocked and dismissed and called a fool, on this 17-year-old orphan who had built something that none of them understood. "Why?" he managed to croak. Sigrid looked at him with her father's eyes. "Because that is what the wood is for," she said. "When have you seen someone repay cruelty with kindness? What does it take to help the people who doubted you?" Words spread through the storm like fire through dry grass. The Brennan girl has wood. The Brennan girl has heat. The tunnel that everyone laughed at is full of dry firewood, while the rest of us freeze. They came in 1s and 2s at first. Henrik returned with his family. all of them bundled up beyond recognition, stumbling through the snow in a human chain tied together with rope. Gustav Lindqvist came next, the Swedish miner who had told Sigrid her tunnel would collapse. His face was gray with cold and something else. Shame, perhaps, or disbelief. 8 families had found their way to Sigrid's cabin by the time day 7 ended. When the sun rose on day 8, 4 more had joined them. 37 people in total, crowded into a 140-square-foot cabin and an 18-foot tunnel. They brought whatever food they had. They brought blankets and children and dogs and the haunted expressions of people who had just learned that everything they knew was wrong. Sigrid gave them wood without question. She did not ask for payment. She did not ask for apologies. She simply opened the tunnel door and let them take what they needed. The seasoned logs burned hot and clean in their frozen hands. Families who had been on the edge of dying found warmth flowing back into their bodies. Children who had stopped shivering began to shiver again, which meant their bodies were fighting once more. Little Britta Lindgren was 7 years old. She had been silent for 6 hours, too cold to speak, too weak to cry. When she finally warmed up enough to move, the first words out of her mouth were, "Can I pet the dog?" Odin lay down beside her and let her wrap her arms around his neck. He stayed there for the rest of the storm, a living blanket for a little girl who had almost died. On the morning of day 8, Margaret Holstad arrived. She came alone. Henrik had offered to accompany her, but she had refused. This was something she needed to do herself. The walk took her 4 hours. She fell more times than she could count. She lost feeling in her hands and feet within the first 20 minutes. But she kept going, driven by something stronger than the cold. She needed to see. She needed to know. Sigrid met her at the door. The 2 women looked at each other across a threshold that separated warmth from death. "Come in," Sigrid said. The cabin was crowded with bodies. Families huddled together, sharing blankets, sharing heat, sharing the strange intimacy of survival. A fire burned in the fireplace, clean and hot, producing more warmth than any of them had felt in days. Margaret looked around at the people she knew, the people who had listened to her criticism of this girl, the people who had nodded when she called Sigrid a fool. They were alive because of the fool. "Show me," Margaret said quietly. "Show me the tunnel." Sigrid led her outside to the entrance in the hillside. She opened the door and let Margaret step inside. The tunnel stretched 18 feet into the earth, timber-lined and solid, wire filled with rack after rack of perfectly seasoned wood. Margaret picked up a log and felt its weight, light, dry, the color of good firewood that had been seasoned for a year outdoors. But this wood had been green 6 weeks ago. She knew because she had watched Sigrid carry fresh-cut logs into this tunnel in October. She had laughed about it to her friends. She had said the wood would rot. She had said the girl would freeze. She had been wrong about everything. Margaret set the wood down slowly. She turned to face Sigrid, the 17-year-old girl who had been orphaned by a flood, the 17-year-old girl who had been thrown out by her uncle with $12 and no place to go. The 17-year-old girl who had remembered what her father taught her and built something that none of them understood. "Why, I was wrong," Margaret said. Her voice cracked on the words. "I called you a fool. I told everyone you would die. I laughed at what you were building." She paused, struggling to keep her composure. "I was wrong about all of it." Sigrid looked at her for a long moment. She thought about all the times she had wanted someone to say those words, all the times she had wanted to prove the doubters wrong, all the anger she had swallowed when they mocked her father's knowledge. The anger was gone now. There was nothing left but a kind of tired peace. "My father taught me," she said simply. "His knowledge came from my grandfather. They were not fools either." Margaret nodded. Tears were freezing on her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. "Can you teach us?" she asked. "When the storm ends, can you teach us how to build these tunnels?" Sigrid smiled for the first time in weeks. My father never charged for teaching, she said. Neither will I. Father Callahan arrived on the ninth day, just hours before the storm finally broke. He had stayed in town through the worst of it, tending to his congregation, praying with families who feared they would not survive the night. He had heard reports of people going to the Brennan property. He had heard that the orphan girls' tunnel was saving lives. He came to see for himself. The walk nearly killed him. He was 62 years old, not built for trudging through waist-deep snow and minus 40-degree weather. By the time he reached the cabin on the ridge, his lips were blue and his eyes were glazed. Sigrid pulled him inside and wrapped him in blankets by the fire. She gave him hot tea that she had been brewing almost continuously for 2 days. She did not say anything about his visit in October, when he had suggested that her father's knowledge was foolish desperation. Father Callahan warmed slowly. He looked around at the faces crowded into the small cabin. He recognized most of them. He had baptized some of them, married others, buried their parents. They were alive because a 17-year-old girl had trusted her dead father more than she trusted the living community. When he could speak again, he turned to Sigrid. I came to apologize, he said. I doubted you. I doubted your father's teaching. I suggested that you were clinging to grief rather than wisdom. He paused, his voice rough with emotion. I was wrong. Forgive me. Sigrid looked at the old priest. She thought about her father, he who had respected this man even when they disagreed. She thought about all the funerals Father Callahan had conducted, all the families he had comforted, all the good he had done in his life. There is nothing to forgive, she said. You were worried about me. That is not a sin. Father Callahan bowed his head. When he raised it again, his eyes were wet. Your father was a good man, he said. He would be proud of what you have done. Sigrid felt something break loose in her chest, something she had been holding tight since the day she watched the flood take her parents away. She did not cry, but it was a near thing. Thank you, she whispered. The storm ended on January 21st. 9 days of sustained minus 47-degree temperatures. 9 days of 55-mile-per-hour winds. And 9 days of snow so thick that people got lost walking 20 feet from their own doors. When it was over, the survivors emerged into a world transformed. Snow lay 15 feet deep in places. Buildings had collapsed under the weight. Animals had frozen where they stood. The landscape looked like something from another planet, white and silent and utterly still. 67 people had died across 4 counties. Not one of them had been in Sigrid's tunnel. In the silence after the storm, what do you think each of those survivors was feeling? Gratitude? Shame? Something more complicated? Spring came late that year, as if nature was apologizing for what it had done. The snow took until May to fully melt. The ground was muddy and scarred, marked by the graves that had to wait until the earth was soft enough to dig. 67 graves across 4 counties, 67 families grieving, while the birds returned and the trees began to bud. But life continued. Life always continued. Henrik Holstad came to Sigrid's property in early June. He brought lumber from his yard, good quality timber that he had selected himself. He brought tools and hardware and everything she would need to build a proper house. I cannot pay you what you are owed, he said. You saved my family. You saved half the families in this territory. There is no payment for that. But I can give you this. Sigrid looked at the wagon loaded with supplies. It was worth more than the $12 she had started with. It was worth more than all the money she had ever seen in her life. You do not owe me anything, she said. I know. Oh, that is why I am giving it to you. She built a new house that summer, larger than the cabin, with 2 bedrooms and a proper kitchen and windows that faced the valley below. She kept the original cabin as a woodshed. She kept the tunnel exactly as it was. Families came from across the territory to see the tunnel that had saved them. Gustav Lindqvist came most often. The Swedish miner who had told Sigrid her tunnel would collapse spent 3 weeks studying the construction, asking questions, taking notes. I was wrong about the engineering, he admitted one afternoon. But I understand now. The timber lining creates stability. The slope creates drainage. The airflow prevents moisture buildup. It is simple when you see it, simple and obvious. I do not know why none of us thought of it. Because you were not taught, Sigrid said. Where knowledge does not come from nowhere. Someone has to pass it down. Gustav nodded slowly. Then pass it down to me. Teach me how to build these tunnels. I will build them for others who need them. By autumn of 1888, 7 new tunnels had been dug into hillsides across the territory. By the following spring, the number had doubled. By 1893, 23 tunnels dotted the landscape around Duluth, all of them based on Sigrid's design, all of them producing perfectly seasoned wood in 6 weeks. Henrik Holstad began selling tunnel-seasoned wood at his lumberyard. He called it Brennan System Wood and charged a premium for it. He offered to split the profits with Sigrid. She refused. The knowledge was never mine to sell, she said. It belonged to my grandfather and my father. I am just passing it forward. Sigrid married in the autumn of 1893. His name was Declan Gallagher, a timber worker from Ireland who had arrived in Minnesota the year after the Great Storm. He had heard the stories about the girl who saved the valley. He had seen the tunnels and understood immediately what they meant. When he met Sigrid, he did not see a legend. He saw a woman who worked hard and spoke little and carried knowledge that most people had forgotten. He saw someone he wanted to spend his life with. They married in Father Callahan's church, with half the territory in attendance. Margareta Holstad sat in the front row. She had become something like a friend to Sigrid in the years since the storm, a friendship built on respect rather than obligation. The wedding was simple, and the reception was held in the new house Sigrid had built. There was music and dancing and laughter. There was a toast to Patrick Brennan, who had given his daughter the gift that saved them all. Odin sat by the fireplace through the celebration, old now, his muzzle gray, his movements slow. He had been with Sigrid through everything, through the loss of her parents, through the rejection by her family, through the building of the tunnel and the storm that proved her right. He died peacefully in the spring of 1901, 14 years old, curled up by the fire he had slept beside since he was a puppy. Sigrid buried him on the hillside near the tunnel entrance, where he had spent so many hours watching her work. She carved a marker herself. Odin, good dog, good friend. 1887 to 1901. Sigrid Brennan Gallagher died on March 15, 1949. She was 79 years old. She had raised 4 children and seen 11 grandchildren born. She had taught every one of them how to build a drying tunnel, even though most of them would never need to. You never know, she told them. You never know when the old knowledge will save someone's life. Her children and grandchildren were with her when she passed. The room was warm, heated by wood that had been seasoned in the original tunnel, which was still functioning 62 years after she built it. Her last words were about her father. He gave me more than $12, she said. He gave me a way to survive. The Duluth Historical Society documented the tunnel system after her death. Researchers from the University of Minnesota came to study the construction, to measure the airflow, and to understand how a 17-year-old girl with no formal engineering training had built something that outperformed modern seasoning methods. They found that the tunnel maintained temperatures between 38 and 42 degrees year-round. They found that the convection system moved air at a consistent rate of 2 to 3 feet per second. They found that wood placed in the tunnel reached 15% moisture content in 4 to 6 weeks, compared to 6 to 12 months for outdoor seasoning in the same climate. They also found notes carved into the tunnel walls, temperature readings from 6 decades of winters, observations about airflow and moisture, a hand-drawn diagram of the original construction, labeled in Sigrid's careful handwriting, and at the very end of the tunnel, almost hidden in the shadows, Ain't a single sentence carved deep into the timber. For Papa, who taught me everything. Epilogue. The tunnel still stands today. The Duluth Historical Society maintains it as a heritage site. A bronze plaque marks the entrance. Brennan Tunnel, built 1887 by Sigrid Brennan, age 17. This tunnel saved 12 families during the Great Storm of January 1888. School groups visit sometimes, learning about the old ways of surviving winter. Engineers come to study the passive ventilation system. Historians come to document the story of a girl who remembered what her father taught her. Modern science has validated everything Sigrid knew in 1887. The principles she used, convection-driven airflow, constant underground temperatures, controlled moisture removal, are now standard in passive house design and sustainable architecture. And I see what seemed like folk wisdom turned out to be sophisticated engineering. In the winter of 1978, 90 years after the Great Storm, a team of researchers from the University of Minnesota set up instruments inside Sigrid's tunnel. They measured temperature at 12 points along the 18-foot length. They measured humidity at the entrance and exit. They measured airflow velocity and direction. They filled the tunnel with green wood and monitored the moisture content every week for 2 months. The results confirmed what Sigrid had known in 1887. The tunnel maintained a steady 40 degrees regardless of outside temperature. The convection system moved air continuously at 2.3 feet per second. Wood reached optimal moisture content in 39 days, compared to an average of 7 months for outdoor seasoning in the same climate. The lead researcher, a professor of environmental engineering, stood at the tunnel entrance on the final day of the study. Snow was falling gently outside, the same snow that had been falling in Minnesota for thousands of years. "This is remarkable," he said to his team. A 17-year-old girl with no engineering training built a passive climate control system that we are only now beginning to understand. She used principles that modern architects are rediscovering as cutting-edge, sustainable design. He looked at the bronze plaque on the entrance, at the name Sigrid Brennan and the year 1887. "We think we invented everything," he said quietly, "but most of the time, we are just remembering what our grandparents already knew." Patrick Brennan died in a flood in 1885, but his knowledge passed from his wife's father in the mountains of Norway, survived in a notebook his daughter carried in a canvas sack. That knowledge, written in careful handwriting and translated into timber and earth, saved 12 families and 37 people who would have died without it. That knowledge, passed from grandfather to father to daughter, changed the way an entire community prepared for winter. Sigrid Brennan never forgot where her knowledge came from. Every time she taught someone how to build a tunnel, she told them about her father and grandfather. Every time a new tunnel was dug in the hillsides around Duluth, she made sure people understood that the system was not hers. It belonged to generations of people who had lived and died in climates that killed the unprepared. She was just the one who remembered, and sometimes remembering is the most important thing anyone can do. The end. This story is about Sigrid and her tunnel, but it is also about the knowledge that was passed to you from your parents, your grandparents, the people who taught you what they knew. What wisdom are you carrying that the world has forgotten? What will you pass down to those who come after you? If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The knowledge that saves us is often the knowledge we almost forgot. Keep it alive. Pass it down. That is how we honor the people who taught us.